Hello, thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott, in Oxford in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford Jayungar, in Washington, DC, to the 55th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button, not the chat button. These will come to me during the session and I will try and put them to the panel to consider. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you so that there's not a bottleneck at the end. So I'm looking forward greatly to today's very interesting panel discussion. Over to you, Sandy.
As am I, Mike. Thank you very much. We have a special situation today, our 55th such program, in that we have everyone on the panelists speaking from a different place. Lisa Fazio is in Nashville, Lauren Gibbons in Detroit, Carlos Hernandez Echeverria is in Madrid, Martin Shipton's in Cardiff in Wales, and Martin Williams is in St. Asaph in Northern Wales. And as Mike said, he's in Oxford and I'm in Washington. We're very happy to have such a qualified panel. I think that Carlos is one of the best known fact checkers in the world. So it's going to be very interesting to hear from him. He's made quite a specialty of this. Martin Shipton is the associate editor of Nation Cymru, a Welsh national news website, and has been active in journalism for quite a long time. Martin Williams is a communications and public relations person in Cardiff, at the capital of Wales. And Lauren Gibbons has had a particular experience with this subject in Michigan, and we'll explain why we've got her with us as we go along. Carlos, I wonder if we can start with you. I'm not seeing you on my screen at the moment, but I think that's we're
I'm here. I
Now I
promise.
see you. There you are. So fact checking is something, as I came up in my journalism career, that we were all very proud of doing. It helped us avoid mistakes and increased our credibility, and it was a good faith exercise, a common sense endeavor, reduce misunderstanding. So why, in your view, from the international perspective, why has it become so controversial suddenly?
That's a great answer. I don't think fact checking was ever very popular among liars, and that hasn't changed a lot in the last few years. I think fact checking has taken a more precise role, or there is more fully dedicated fact checkers that work outside of fact checking or of traditional media. I would say, like, basically investigating claims that are made publicly, and I think that has made us into an enemy for people who don't like to be contradicted in a way. And recently we have very powerful people that are more and more allergic to being contradicted in public and to being told they are not speaking according to the facts. And I see they claim censorship. My own opinion is that they honestly don't like to be told they might be wrong. So I think that's why we have become somehow a controversial profession in the last few years, because the tolerance for being contradicted in public by people in power has become, a much much less common, this ability to stand criticism and respond.
Thank you. Lisa, as a psychologist, you're at Vanderbilt University. I hope I said that already. You have studied how people learn new information, both true and false, and how to correct errors in people's knowledge. And it does seem to be something that more and more of us have to think about sometimes, is how to set people straight about what's really true and what's not. How do you understand why this has become more of a problem?
I think part of it is what Carlos is saying, that people don't like being told that they're wrong, and that sometimes people, that makes them feel like it's censorship, or that someone's not allowing them to say what they believe. But in my mind, fact checking is the exact opposite of censoring free speech. It's adding additional speech to the conversation. It's telling people, this is what scientists know about the topic. This is what we know based on the evidence. Here's kind of what we as journalists or scientists think is true. That's not infringing on anyone's ability to believe something different or to say something different. It's adding extra context and extra speech to the conversation.
Martin Shipton, in your own career in journalism in the United Kingdom, what has fact checking been an issue for you at any particular time? And does it take the same importance in the UK as it does in the United States? And you're on mute, by the way, so you want to come off mute before you answer.
Yes, what I would say actually is that so far as journalists in the UK are concerned, this is traditional journalists, if you like, and people who have got an interest in public interest journalism. The idea of telling the truth is something which is embedded in their attitude towards their job, and therefore the fact checking is not actually done by a separate department, as it is in some contexts. It's actually supposed to be done by the journalists themselves when they're getting their stories together. Last year, there was a situation that I was involved in Wales, where we had the First Minister who was behaving very badly, as it turned out. There were a number of scandals that he was involved with. It was very, very important to ensure when we were writing about what he was doing that we got our facts right. And so we were very scrupulous in ensuring, as we always would be, but particularly in these circumstances where we knew that it would have potentially very serious political consequences, that everything had to be absolutely spot on. And indeed, as a result of the stories that I and others wrote, he was eventually forced to resign. So in those circumstances, you have to be absolutely dedicated to it. Now, what I would say as well is, the other hat that I wear is as a trade union representative. And last week, this is coincidental, I found myself in a position where I was representing somebody who was a member of the National Union of Journalists in the UK, who was being made redundant. He was a fact checker. He was working for a company that was whose headquarters was in India, but they had 40 people operating in Britain. And as a result of decisions taken by TikTok and by Meta to dispense with fact checking, these 40 people are being made redundant from their jobs. And so I was asked to go along and represent this one particular person. And I really found it, very worrying and I was speaking to the owner of the company, the guy who had set it up some years ago, who was obviously very committed to telling the truth and to ensuring that the truth was told in the material that his clients were putting out. And it's really quite a devastating situation. Not only are people losing their jobs, but as a result of the fact that they will not be working any longer, it will mean that the likelihood of false information being purveyed, to many millions of people is that much greater.
Well, some people want to do that. Some people want precisely to do that. And so this is a good development for them. Martin Williams, just briefly, you, in your particular field, communications, public relations, I should think that you get the feeling of being watched very carefully sometimes to make sure you aren't making exaggerations or claiming wonderful things about products or people or phenomena that cannot be proven. So how does fact checking affect you?
I have no idea what you could be talking about at all. I like Martin. I come from a similar background. I'm at the top of Wales here, but my background is in journalism for more than 25 years. So I've approached PR with the same, fact checking is ingrained in everything I do day to day. So yes, of course, there's some spin there, but I always make sure everything I put out there is accurate, as I always try to do as a journalist. It has become more and more difficult, even in PR, to the way I approach PR is as a journalist. So giving both sides of the story, not just putting something out from a client and then let you make up your mind or let you decide whether that's right or wrong. I still try and get more than one voice in there so that, it can be substantiated and corroborated, whether it's a serious story. And obviously there's crisis communications as an element to that as well. So ensuring, again, you're getting the right information out there. But fact checking, obviously it's more difficult than ever. You would think it would be easier given the amount of information out there. Because of the amount of misinformation out there, it's become more and more difficult to corroborate a story and get the most accurate press release or article out there for public consumption. A quick example from myself is I did a story on a health condition recently, trying to get some statistics to back up the press release with the spokesperson I had. And I really struggled to get, the facts and figures to go with that to prove what they were saying. In the end, I managed to get through to the organization responsible for that. It was a mental health story. And there was several think tanks that put facts and figures out, several charities of different organizations. You often get different businesses, for example, insurance, legal sector, putting things out on these things. And it turned out a lot of the reports I'd read were completely false from think tanks and other sources that were already out there in the public. And luckily, but it took days of me chasing. And unfortunately, journalists don't have days now. They don't even, they're minutes rather than hours now. And we touched upon earlier about, the hits and the clicks and things that they're judged upon. So, but I try to still approach it as a journalist and try to always put out the most accurate information and check all my facts myself. But sadly, a lot of journalists in particular don't have that time anymore. They're time poor.
Absolutely. Lauren, I've saved you for last because you have a very particular perspective on how this became a political issue and why it did specifically in the heartland state of Michigan. Perhaps you could bring us up to date on that story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest challenge for a lot of Michigan journalists really started in 2020 after the 2020 election, because we had presidential candidate Donald Trump claiming that he won the 2020 election. And there is still a subset of Michigan voters who believe that the 2020 election was not won by President Biden. And in the immediate aftermath, a lot of journalists, including myself, were trying to, put out these fact checks, tell people this is what we're seeing. We were following some of the claims that were being made, and time and again, we were finding that these claims were not factual, and we were reporting that. And the most ardent supporters of Donald Trump were really upset about that. And so in one instance, a state lawmaker in 2021 introduced a legislation that did not get passed, I should say right off the bat, but he introduced legislation to create a state registry of quote unquote fact checkers, essentially trying to get a registry of journalists on the books and make it so it would be easier for people to sue them if they didn't like what was in the coverage. Ultimately, it didn't go anywhere. It didn't get any committee hearings or support from the broader populace, but it really did highlight the fact that a lot of Trump supporters in particular were not accepting the facts. And I still deal with that to this day here in my current role at nonprofit newsroom Bridge, Michigan. Every time we get rallies, when the president comes or when other high profile political figures come, our role, we see, we do pretty real time fact checks of what the candidates are saying, and try to, inform readers about the legitimacy of their claims and the policy issues. But it remains a real challenge, simply because there's a very pervasive belief that 2020 elections were, somehow incorrect.
So does this affect your day-to-day work? I mean, do people challenge you and try to say that you're a political operative yourself for when you're reporting what you have determined to be the facts?
Yeah, it's gotten a little better over time. Certainly 2025, the circumstances were a little different in the 2024 election, but in the aftermath of the 2020 election, yes, it was a real challenge. And as one of the panelists earlier mentioned, it took a little bit longer even to put what would normally be simple stories together, because you just had to make sure every single sentence, every single word was exactly what you meant to say, because people would be scrutinizing everything you said, whether it was on TV in an interview or in print journalism. There was so much scrutiny and so much anger and frustration and, just a lot of ill will towards journalists who, we were just calling it as we see it. So it was definitely a big challenge for every journalist here in Michigan.
Sure. So Carlos, not to avoid the obvious, has the election of Donald Trump to a second, albeit non-continuous term as president, affected this phenomenon, this need for fact-checking around the world, all the more than was the case before? And you're on mute, so you might want to just take that off.
I think the election was pretty consequential, like in super real life terms. If I like to give you just an example, all these lines that Donald Trump has been feeding over the last few months about fact checkers being engaging in, open warfare against conservatives everywhere. That in Europe, for example, that has had very real consequences. Like a fact checking newsroom in Georgia, not the U.S. state, obviously, the former Soviet Republic. They had the police on the newsroom. At the next day, these statements happened because the Attorney General in Georgia, a government that is closer to Russia and the new administration in the US, took that kind of statements from Vice President J.D. Vance and the president as proof that fact checkers in the country were kind of engaging in a master plan to operate as foreign agents against the government. So sometimes with this criticism about obscure and dark motivations by fact checkers come from the US, they do have very real consequences in the rest of the world. I think we have seen that in like fact-checking organizations, these organizations that normally dedicate themselves only to fact-checking and anti-disinformation work, they are going through a very, very hard time in terms of, this political pressure on donors everywhere that have been sustaining our journalism through the years. It has certainly changed. There is a lot of people that don't want to get in the crosshairs of the new administration. and they are acting as we speak in trying to, you know, make some of them are philanthropists. I think we are all familiar with this, but many of these philanthropists are honestly saying, okay, I'm a very rich guy somewhere. If I'm funding, I don't know, you know, some research on cancer, which is great and nobody can oppose, that's great. And that's going to get me not the kind of death threats and political pressures that I get when I fund fact-checking or anti-disinformation work. So I would say the change in the administration has changed the attitude of many, many people that were very important for us to keep doing our work in terms of audiences, funders, the platforms, as Martin was mentioning before. So yeah, definitely a pretty big change in the way, you know, the new administration has been able to legitimize some of the discourse about fact-checking and also some of the real pressures they are able to exert.
Thanks. So Lisa, your research has become somewhat political in its orientation as well, I imagine. That's probably not something you anticipated earlier in your career.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that my work has become political as much as it's been politicized by outside forces. So I've been studying these basic science questions on how do people learn false information for almost 20 years now. And really in the past 5 years, we've started to see these kind of regular attacks on misinformation researchers to the point that a couple of weeks ago, my federal grant from NSF to study these topics was canceled, along with that of at least 50 other mis and disinformation researchers in the US. So we no longer align with agency priorities, and so there can be no research on misinformation, how best to teach digital media literacy, how can we detect AI deepfakes, any of the work we'd want to do to kind of improve the information ecosystem has now been targeted for elimination.
Well, not to press this point too hard, but you are Exhibit A of someone who has had a very serious effect on your work, your career, your credibility, I suppose, in some respects. And how do you see coming back from this? I mean, do you see this as a permanent change, or will there be a moment when your field gets restored to honor and credibility?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't know what's going to happen. As Carlos was just saying, in the past, private foundations have been willing to fund this research. Now there's more reluctance to do so because they are also being attacked if they publicly support this type of research. I'm hopeful that in the future we'll have an administration that values truth and values research on understanding how people come to form false beliefs and how we can correct them. But for the moment, that is not what this administration is looking for.
Martin, as a person who lives at least on the fringes of Europe, post-Brexit, are those of us, I mean, as you can imagine, here in Washington, this sort of thing is talked about, I mean, continuously would not do justice to the obsession that we all have with these questions and these issues that I'm a former director of the Voice of America, which has been destroyed. And we're very, there are efforts to bring it back and so on. And a lot of comparisons are drawn now quite actively to a dark period in Europe some 80 years ago when very similar things happened. And there was not the technology, obviously, by any means that we're talking about now. But should we all calm down a little bit and say this will pass? or should we be recruiting people around the world to join our cause?
Well, I think the difficulty is that there are an awful lot of people in Britain, and I know that it happens in the United States as well, who are influenced by the fact that they're not listening to mainstream news channels, and they have a very disdainful attitude towards mainstream news channels. And what they're doing is taking the information which they are believing from, if you like, and obviously I say this as somebody who's got skin in the game, from malign forces who are anxious to promote conspiracy theories and to purvey false information. And the difficulty, I think, is that if people block themselves off from a variety of mainstream news sources, which, whatever you may think of them, are run by and have people working for them who are properly trained in the ability to respect the truth and to try to convey facts, then the whole basis of society is under threat from malign forces that can seek to influence people in a way that is of benefit to certain minorities. So, I mean, we now have a situation in Britain where opinion polls are putting a political party led by Nigel Farage, who was one of the main instigators of Brexit, is leading in the polls. And they have been extremely adept at getting messages to people through social media, particularly using Facebook. And what they want to do is to really, in a sense, take people away from mainstream media so that they can control the agenda and get very particular messages to their audience. And I think that that is having a very damaging effect on public discourse, because apart from the disagreements that people have, it has really wound a lot of people up into a point where it's no longer possible to have a civilized conversation, because anybody who doesn't agree with you is an enemy, and therefore you will do your damnedest to do them down. You're not interested in having a conversation. What you want to do is to crush them into the ground. And there's a lot of that going on, I'm afraid, in Britain. I think from my observation, that's happening in the United States as well. So it is something which we have to be very concerned about, and we have to try to move through this and to cherish the truth.
Martin, do you have your own personal rules about which clients you'll take on and which you will not? So that you don't, I can imagine someone in your position and in your profession could get trapped in some, and maybe propaganda is too strong a word to use for the
Yeah,
particular
I think I'm quite
case.
lucky where I am geographically. I think that it's political where we are, but not that political in that I would need to pick and choose which organisations I work with. I think I've mostly worked with industries that are pretty non-political, and I stay that way as well. But echoing what Martin, the other Martin, says there about you're almost fact checking. People pick and choose what information they might read a news article and pick and choose what works for them, what works for their narrative, and that goes for obviously the politicians here in the UK you can speak to, and obviously you see it across the pond there in America as well. But you're fact checking on a daily basis. I'm a father of 3 children as well, varying ages. One's at university, 2 in school, and they'll come to me with something my daughter this week, something she'd read in the news, and obviously the news quickly became that she read it on Facebook, and it quickly became that it wasn't accurate, and you're fact checking her. But you can't go around tapping everybody on the shoulder and informing them of what is right and what isn't right, what is wrong, because they're not going to the news sources that we would go to, reputable journalists, etc. So it is difficult. It's a difficult climate
Lauren, do you see yourself as a warrior for the truth? I mean, it must be difficult. You're working now for Bridge, Michigan, which I assume is not referring to a big bridge, but to the bridge between the public and the information that they need. And I think there are quite a lot of states where people are wondering. Pennsylvania is one where I have particular involvement myself, is wondering whether the citizens or the residents, let's say, so as not to use an overly loaded political term, where the residents don't necessarily have enough information to navigate to navigate their daily lives and their relationship with the government and with the powers that be. Are you in a pivotal position for that problem?
You know, I don't know that I would necessarily characterize myself as a warrior per se, but the path
Maybe.
the path that I choose to take and a mission that I find truly important is to bring often very complex, complicated, and really emotionally charged political issues home to people to help them understand what they may not understand. You know, if they were just to watch a committee hearing or listen to a speech. And I see myself as in a role of contextualizing what a lot of what is happening right now. And in a big way, so many changes happening at the Trump administration is affecting Michigan residents on the ground right now. That's been pretty much the main focus of my job since January 20th. Just explaining to people how all of these things that the president is saying and doing have a big impact on their lives. Here in Michigan, tariffs, for example, is a huge issue here in Michigan with the auto industry and related manufacturers. That's a major issue and something that is already having pretty historic impacts on Michigan's economy. And to Lisa's point earlier, we have a ton of research institutions that are losing bleeding funding by the minute as they get notifications from DOJ. You know, offices are closing. Resources that were available to people may not be available to people anymore, and there's obviously a lot of legal challenges happening, so everything is kind of up in the air. And I see my role not only to fact check and inform people of exactly what the facts are, but also bring those issues home to them and contextualize what's going on and how it impacts their future.
Well, can you tell us a few words about Bridge, Michigan, and what form it takes, and who supports it? And is it a free medium of information, or do people have to subscribe?
Yeah, absolutely. Bridge Michigan is a nonpartisan, nonprofit newsroom here in Michigan. We focus exclusively on state politics, policy issues here in Michigan. I would liken us to, you know, the Baltimore Banner, Texas Tribune, very similar concept and mission. We accept donations from the public, and we also accept grants. You know, we run as a nonprofit organization, but our mission is really, you know, nonpartisan, news focused, and also to your point, very accessible journalism. We don't charge, we never will. It's a free platform to get nuanced, balanced, nonpartisan coverage.
So this is happening all across the country. In many states, there are similar institutions. Do you think, and do your colleagues in the other such institutions, there's one called Spotlight PA for Pennsylvania, which it sounds to me is very similar. Are you going to thrive and survive? Is this the future of local journalism?
I spent many years working for daily newspapers, and I've spent 3 years now working for nonprofit. And I personally really believe in our mission. I have really valued the opportunity to, get away a little bit from the daily grind, and our readers also seem to value that too. We really dig in on the issues that we choose to cover. It is obviously a process to a lot of what everyone is talking about on this call, choosing what to fact check and how to fact check it in the most appropriate manner is often difficult. There's so much that you could be doing. So really homing in on what's the most important for readers continues to be an ongoing conversation for us. But me personally, I feel really strongly and really proud of what Bridge is able to do with a pretty small staff compared to a lot of major metro dailies. We really are trying to make sure that people have all of the facts that they need to make political decisions.
Carlos says what what Lauren describes happening in Michigan sound familiar? Is this going on in many other countries as well?
I think there's definitely a movement of, as the traditional business model for the media sector, and I come from television, so it doesn't get any more traditional really. But I think that business model has become complicated with the competition or obliteration from the digital platforms in terms of advertising. I think there is a lot of actors trying to do independent journalism and funding it in different ways. And I think that Lauren was mentioning something that is also pretty central to what we do at Maldita, which is like try to think about ways in which we can serve our audiences in a very direct way and be very responsive, and to provide the kind of a relationship with their news sources that is not the one they have maybe with their local paper or the major media. Like for us, it has become and the idea that people is mostly the communities we serve through automated tip lines and that kind of thing is basically guiding our editorial coverage on what we investigate and what we fact check. Right now I would say it's 90% of what we do is basically stuff that people is sending to us through private messaging, in our case WhatsApp. And it's like it's giving us like a live survey every day of what our people is caring about, like why they feel it's fishy, might be disinformation or might be just incredible but real. So that's the way we have gone about it. I think that is a movement that is going globally, and I can see it doing nothing but to grow in the coming years, because the traditional ways to set up a news organization and try to do journalism are becoming more restrictive and more difficult. So I think this other model, which is also no way to be rich, but it's working in many places around the world.
Lisa, Carlos just used an old-fashioned, gentle word that sometimes things sound fishy, and it sort of harks back to a nicer time, a more gentle time than we're experiencing right now. A lot of people ask me, I run this free speech project, and I have had a long journalism career. They ask me, well, are lies protected by the First Amendment? Are lies covered by free speech? And when someone asks you that, what do you say?
I say that I am not a free speech expert and do not know the rules around it. It's outside of my expertise.
But what would you be reassured to people and say, don't worry about it, the truth will come out eventually? Or
no, I think there needs to be an active search for the truth. The truth doesn't magically appear. It appears because people looked into how does this conform with reality and what's the evidence behind these claims. One thing I'm sure Carlos has dealt with is across the world, different nations are more or less open with the types of data that you need to fact check political statements. If you're in a country that doesn't provide easy access to information about GDP, about kind of all of the stats around unemployment, things like that, then fact checking politicians' statements becomes even more difficult because you don't have access to what is the ground truth. And you're starting to see that in the US as well, where data sets are going down or becoming corrupted, and you're losing access to these reliable sources of information that could be used to determine this is true, this is false, this is a little fishy.
I think you made a very important statement when you say there needs to be an active search for the truth. And of course, that takes resources. I'm sure Lauren would be the first to say that it sometimes seems like a hand-to-mouth exercise that people have to engage in, have to hope for corporate support, both moral support and non selfish financial support in some way. Martin Williams, do you think there are corporate supporters of this search for the truth that can be relied upon?
Speaking from the UK, it's difficult to answer that, but just going back to the active search point that Lisa made about the fact that you do have to search harder than ever for the truth when it should be easier than ever. You've lost 2,000-3,000 newspaper titles in the US over the last 15-20 years. We've lost hundreds and hundreds of newspaper titles in the UK. I mean, 3 titles I work for on my own don't exist anymore. So in terms of searching for the truth, it's become more and more difficult, and it should be easier than ever. But because of how political the world is now, it's a lot of people step back in industry and business. Like you said, now if it doesn't suit their narrative, they're going to step forward and put their head above the parapet and face off against governments and politics. And that goes for the UK especially, as well as the US. After Brexit and the rise of reform and these other political things going on, who's going to push back? It's difficult to answer.
It is hard. One point I want to interject at the moment is for our audience, non-participant audience out there, if you have questions, I can't see from where I sit whether there are questions piling up in the Q&A button, but if you have them, this would be a good time to put them in so that Mike Scott in just a couple moments can pick those up. Martin Shipton, are you optimistic that these issues are going to get constructively worked on and we're going to feel less stress about them sometime soon, or are you a pessimist?
I think a lot of it has to do with the economics of journalism. And one initiative that our union has pressed in Wales is for the Welsh government to be prepared to put in public money to support new news outlets, particularly those who are operating at a very local level. I mean, the organisation that I now work for, Nation.Cymru, has received grants, and it's all done at one remove level. So you don't get money directly from the Welsh government. You get money from, counterintuitively, the Welsh Books Council, which in turn is funded by the Welsh government. And I think that is a recognition that for a publication which is quite new, it's also digitally focused. There is no print edition. It's extremely difficult to make sufficient money to have a properly functioning newsroom without public assistance, and that is a reality. There's lots of, or a number of countries in Europe have been doing this for decades. Places like Sweden, for example, local papers are very strongly subsidized in Sweden. Of course, there is the ethical issue which arises about, is it appropriate to take public money, and is there any chance that the the politicians who run the government could then seek to exert influence on the publication. Well, that's the reason why they have this arm's length approach, where it is funded via a sort of quasi-independent body. I think there will always be appetite for the truth, for people to find out what is going on, for the news. There are people within the newspaper industry who I think became disillusioned about that, and they then have veered off in another direction, so that they will be more interested in what they perceive to be entertainment than in the informing of the public. Whether a lot of news is trivialized, and they make news out of trivia. But public interest journalism, I think, still has an audience for it. It's just the survival of it, and the hopefully the resurrection of it. And as the other Martin was saying, there have been a lot of newspapers that have closed down, both in the UK and in the United States. The way to revive them is to find some kind of business model which may involve some kind of public funding in order to enable organizations to survive, thrive, and for new ones to be established.
Sounds good, but just I might note one of the perhaps less well publicized executive orders of Donald Trump is that the other day he said that all government money, direct or indirect, to public broadcasting, to public radio and public television, should be cut off. And there was a mechanism established here back in the 1970s that set up something called the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which was the CPB, which was to be the intermediary and of the sort that you described, a pass-through to sort of protect that money from getting partisan in any way. And whether it will be adequately fought in the courts and whether the courts will be obeyed, which is a big question right now in this country, we don't know. Mike Scott, I assume you got some questions there that you'd like to raise on behalf of remote participants.
Fine, thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion so far. Angela Preston, good to hear from you again, Angela. I haven't heard from you for a while. Hope you're well. She says, do reporters fact check women more than men? Lauren.
I would say that I don't seek out. I fact check the politicians that come before me, and I think the underlying subtext is maybe there's a different standard or scrutiny held to women in positions of power, and that's something that I, as a woman journalist, am very sensitive to, and really actively try to ensure that my coverage of any politician, male or female, is aggressive, fair, and equal across the board.
Lisa, you want to comment on this?
I haven't seen any work that's documented differences across kind of male and female politicians in terms of fact checks or anything like that. I'll say there's often a public concern that in the US, Republicans get fact checked more than Democrats do. But that's because we're in the unfortunate circumstance that right now there is more misinformation and lying happening on the right than there is on the left. So even if you take Republicans and ask them to judge what's true, what's false, they will identify more false stuff coming from Republicans than Democrats. So it's not the fact checkers being biased, it's that our media landscape in the US right now has this general bias.
Fine. Any comments from the gentleman? Martin?
Well, what I would say is that the way that I approach things, and I think the way most journalists probably approach it, is that you evaluate the information that is provided in a way that determines, from your point of view, whether it's accurate or not. And the gender of the individual who's purveying the information is, in a sense, neither here nor there. I mean, you know, last year, when I was heavily involved in scrutinizing the activities of the First Minister, I wasn't scrutinizing him because he was a male. I was scrutinizing him because he was the First Minister. Had he been a female First Minister who was doing exactly the same bad things as he was doing as a male, I would have subjected him to the same scrutiny. So, you know, I do my very best to you know, report without fear or favor. And another thing, of course, which is linked to this, is that clearly in one's work, you know, and over many years, and the longer you do it, the more likely this is to be the case, you will get to know a lot of people. And you know, I've always considered it to be absolutely crucial that anybody that I get to know in politics has to be aware that, you know, we may even socialize, but if I find out something which is to the discredit of this person, or if there's something that I consider to be newsworthy, I will write about it, regardless of whether we have had a friendly relationship or not. And that has to be absolutely clear. And I think that, you know, if you make that clear to people, then they understand the position. Of course, there are some people, some politicians, who just can't stand anybody who disagrees or is prepared to hold them to scrutiny. And those people will, you know, cut you off and not want to speak to you. Well, that's a matter for them. But I think from a journalist point of view, you have to be prepared to scrutinize everyone across the board, regardless also of your own political opinions.
Thank you for that. Nathan asks, thank you for your question, Nathan. Is truth dead? Did we ever have it? Must we accustom ourselves to living in a world of multiple truths? What can individuals do to make sense of the diminishing of fact-checking? Martin Williams, do you want to?
Oh, good. That's a deep one. True, is the truth dead? No, obviously not. But it is. I think again, Lisa used the phrase. I think search for the truth or active truth. It's not dead, but there are, as he says, multiple truths out there now, and you have to try and, it's hard, isn't it, trample through all the misinformation or the disinformation for the most reliable news source or sources to kind of corroborate what the truth is. Though I can feel his pain that that it is more difficult than ever to find the truth. But the truth certainly isn't dead. It is out there, but sadly, it's more difficult to find it.
Carlos, would you like to say something on that? Sorry, I'll come back to you, Lisa. Carlos?
I could love to. I think it's a great question, and it's easy to get dispirited from time to time when you know you live in a world and you see you know the value of truth. But I think it's important to assert that facts do really exist and do really matter, and there are things that happened. You know, we all understand there are certain interpretations and opinions about the facts, but the facts themselves, I think that's, you know, it's super important to make clear that those go beyond opinions and they either happen or not. And I think the work of most fact checkers, I have this very good friend who is in fact checking and who normally says that, you know, fact checkers do not really want to be arbiters of the truth, but very often they are the arbiters of what is absolutely radically false. And I think that's most of the time our work. Like, you know, there is this content that is trying to, you know, for example, you know, it's going on social media and is blaming some people that are normally, you know, migrants from setting a church on fire in this particular village. So the first thing to find out, and it's very often that it's the case, that sometimes that church has never been on fire. And it's actually perfectly standing in their place where it has always been. So I think it's important to make a statement for facts all the time. You know, opinions are great. You are entitled to your opinions. You are not entitled to your own facts. And you are certainly very much subject to people from, you know, all the walks of the world for telling you this didn't happen. And I think that's the real problem here. And I understand how it has become more difficult when some very powerful figures are actively trying, telling you, some true things that are so obviously untruth. And I have a few friends, I'm sorry I'm getting long, but that have been working in Russia over the last 10 years, and they are now expelled. And they have this very interesting version of how, some powerful figures in Russia, and now they can see it in Western countries as well, this massive lying, like unashamed lying, like is also a projection of power for some people. Like by being able to say these things that are so obviously untrue, they are not only trying to convince you, they are also showing that they can do this kind of thing without fearing. And I think we can all see public figures in our own realities that do this, like they are so shameless about it that they can declare themselves independent from facts. But I think it's super important that we resist that kind of movement, because if there is no common set of facts, there cannot be any kind of shared reality or share really understanding of civic life.
Thank you for that. I come to Lisa on that, but as I do so, I was just thinking of Boris Johnson and Brexit, when he said quite simply that it was oven ready, and it clearly was not oven ready by no means. There's a kind of a psychological issue here about people in power. Lisa, as a psychologist, do you want to just comment further on that?
I mean, I was just going to chime in to say that we know that people do want access to facts and access to the truth. They may consume misinformation because it appeals to their existing beliefs and their social identities and things like that. We're all vulnerable to believe false information that appeals to us. But they want an information ecosystem that makes it easier for them to find out true information and the facts as well. And so part of what we're struggling with is, how do you provide the right incentives and the right resources to people in this ecosystem so that we can provide people with easy access to the facts, rather than a lot of easy access to false information from politicians, false information from people trying to sell you things, health supplements, all the things like that. If you have cancer and you're trying to figure out what is going on in my body and what steps should I take next, people want access to real information, not a shuckster selling them magic pills.
Lauren, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, just to continue on that point, sometimes it's a lot harder to find the facts than it is to find, the person is selling the snake oil. And that's where I feel, and, just from personal experience, that's where journalists and fact checkers can really come into play. We know how to file records requests with local and state governments and federal governments. Sometimes that is gotten increasingly more difficult to actually get useful information from government officials, but that's another time, I guess. And it's also, we also know how to try and get factual information from a variety of different sources. It doesn't just have to be from the politicians or from think tanks or lobbying groups. We can go on the ground. We can talk to communities who are directly impacted by this claim that's being made. We can check that in a way that maybe a member of the public might not know how to do. And so I think, just being really open and transparent with the public about how we're going about fact checking, why we're doing it this way, why we're looking into these claims is a really effective tool to build back some of that trust that's been lost. And, one thing that I tell people all the time as I go about reporting, I live in Michigan. I've lived here for a long time. I work here. I also benefit from knowing the truth. I have vested interest in having factual information for myself. And, that's in addition to, my work and trying to get factual information for everyone else. So really separating, the fact checking and separating it from the polarization as much as possible to try and avoid, becoming like part of the machine that people distrust, and say, hey, like, this is something that matters to all of us as a society, can really help, build back some of that trust.
Thanks. I noticed you were nodding your head there, Martin Williams. Did you have anything further to say?
I just echo all that as a former journalist as well. Again, as I said, the truth is out there. It's just the facts are the facts, as Carlos said. It's just about getting to them. But there are more people. There are lots and lots of journalists the world over, and that are reputable and work hard to get those facts out there. But it is getting more and more difficult to do so. It should take a lot less time, given the resources we have now, to do it. But it's the opposite. And and to Lisa's point, actually, with regard to medical condition, I had this with a member of the family. I won't go too much into it, but trying to find something to make them feel at ease about the situation they were going into with an operation. And I was kind of met with dozens of different outcomes and different ways you should recover and different ways you should do this and that. And I was like, okay, perhaps best not to go there. But no, I echo all those words.
Michael, if I can briefly add, because what Lisa was saying seemed to me like exactly on the spot. Like it's becoming much harder to get that kind of quality information, and this information will always be free and actually very much promoted. And I'm very worried about this also when you think about, like, for the last 20 years, we have been mostly looking at our information from the media and then through search engines like Google. But now my nephews and my kids are mostly going to find answers in ChatGPT or any of these generative AI systems. And those are going to be being trained right now on an open web that has less and less quality information, because everybody's paywalling, scientific journals and quality journalism. And I understand why it's paywall and you don't want to make OpenAI rich, but at the same time, for the common person looking for answers, it's going to become harder and harder to get the information that they need. So that's a little scary, I think.
Mike, there's a point related to all this that I'd like to make as well, which is this is quite a positive point in a way, that there are allies that journalists can rely on in certain circumstances. Now, obviously, the pandemic caused a lot of grief, a lot of very serious concerns about how the COVID-19 outbreak was handled. And there is a public inquiry which is currently going on in the UK. And I've been actually working quite closely with a group of COVID bereaved families who are desperate to find out the truth about what happened and why it happened to their relatives who died. And so they have been working very intensively trying to get to the bottom of this. And they, of course, have had a forum because this public inquiry exists. They've been accepted as core participants in this public inquiry, which has given them a platform from which they can get lawyers who represent them to ask very pertinent questions of government ministers about what they were doing and why they didn't do certain things and why they did things which turned out badly. And that, I think, is something which journalists can assist as well in giving publicity to what is going on, and sometimes to do advanced stories about what is going to be asked at the inquiry and this sort of thing. And I've done quite a lot of that myself, and it's quite a positive thing to be able to assist people who have been put into a very difficult position themselves and have suffered greatly as a result of government decisions that weren't the best, to hold government ministers to account for errors that they have made.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. And I would say that as well as journalists, it's also artists in a sense, or dramatists. You think of the post office scandal, so much went on, but it's only because there was a drama on the television that actually has brought out out truths. And even then, we know that there are still things being hidden in the UK, which those in the US may have heard of. But there was a huge scandal where people were blamed for things that they hadn't done and lost their jobs and even imprisoned. They'd all been working in the post office. But anyway, and there's a play about it. I'll come to a final question for each of you. It comes from Von Wright. Von Wright has asked 2 questions, but the first one I think we'd handled. It was to do with Meta. The second one is this. Thanks, Von Wright, for doing this, for giving us this. How do you actively fight the massive amounts of polarization in the media and disinformation? It's a hell of a question to ask at the end, but I'm going to ask everyone individually. If you can say something quite briefly on this one. How do you actively fight the massive amounts of polarization in the media and disinformation? Carlos.
That's a very difficult one, but I could go with something that might seem a little counter intuitive, but do not disengage from the media. Keep on consuming journalism, because as much as we can all see the faults in our profession and in the media sector, and there are many, and I am aware, media consumption is still very, very much correlated with being more aware of the real world and more protected against manipulation. So my first instincts would be, for all the legitimate criticism of media and journalism, news avoidance is a huge gift to people that wants to manipulate you and wants you not to care, but you will eventually care if you disconnect from reality.
Thanks for that. Martin Williams.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and do not give up on the media. But I would speak to younger people. As I said, I've got 3 children, two daughters who are slightly older, in their teens and 20s now, and they don't go on any news out. As far as I'm aware, they probably pick up all their news with whatever news from social media, TikTok, wherever. And I think that it would be good in schools, and I know a lot of universities and colleges do it, to be fair, but it's in schools, demonstrating to younger people how to consume news and how to look for news and how to look for to look for transparency and identify what is real and what isn't, and that's going to be very important for me. I think a lot of us are maybe too, especially speaking for myself, too long in the tooth, and a lot of people, unless it fits their agenda, they won't go looking for the news if it doesn't fit. If they're feeling disillusioned and it doesn't fit in with the way they live their life or what they want to believe, they won't look for it. But I think for young people in particular, it's important we educate them into transparency and what real news is and what facts are, because I think a lot don't know.
Very important point. Thank you very much. Lauren.
I would say the biggest way that we can combat all this is to get outside the bubbles that we naturally align ourselves in. And this got a lot more complicated during and even in post-COVID times, but getting into places and interactions and situations that are a little bit different than what you grew up with and what you knew, that's the biggest way to combat polarization, understanding and empathizing with people who have a completely different background and life experience than you. I think a lot of times we just get in these silos and we think because this is how we grew up, this is our perception of the situation, that's got to be right. And that's how we end up with this polarization and where disinformation breeds. So really just openness to understanding the perspective of other people is what I think really can help us through this.
Thanks. Lisa, next. Briefly, please.
Really quickly, I'll add on to that we all have, of course, political identities, but we also have a lot of other identities. I'm a dog owner, I go to this fitness class, I do this in my free time, people are parents. There's lots of possible identities we have, and I think it can be useful to think outside of just political identities and to think, what other groups am I in? What other characteristics do I share with people? And how can I form those connections?
Thank you. Martin Shipton, Similarly, briefly, please.
Well, I think what's absolutely essential is that people come to understand the need to engage in critical thinking, because there are too many people now who just swallow one way of looking at the world, one way of perceiving things. And the reality is that reality is complex, and that there is always the room to listen to other people who have got different opinions. And the trouble at the moment is that too many people become totally obsessed with one way of looking at things, and then it becomes an extremely antagonistic kind of discussion that takes place with somebody who has a different view, and there doesn't seem to be any ability to have the meeting of minds. Very often it is the case that that people do not have a monopoly on wisdom, and that it's a question of engaging. I mean, going back to my classical education here, engaging in the Socratic dialogue in order to get to truth. So you will discuss something, you'll discuss a proposition, somebody will put forward a counter proposition, and then you will see if you can reach agreement. And that is far more healthy than the sort of shouty, aggressive nonsense that we get so much of these days.
Thank you very much. What a great panel. That's been terrific. Over to you, Sandy. Have you got any final comments you want to make before I close the program?
Well, I want to echo what you just said, Mike, that when you and I started this up 4.5 years ago, this is exactly the kind of discussion we hoped for. And I think coming from so many different perspectives and places and points of view helps out a lot. So I'm grateful to these panels. And I think many people will see this online in the weeks ahead and will appreciate it, because it was a calm and thoughtful discussion. So we're very happy to promote that. We're grateful to Georgetown University and Tom Banchoff, the Vice President for International Affairs, and so many other people here who have encouraged us along the way. And we're going to keep it up.
Well, thanks to you as well for chairing the first part and for helping develop, or being the person behind the development of this whole kind of series. My thanks to everyone today, to all our panelists. I think you've been a fabulous panel today, a great discussion. My thanks to Sandy. At Blackfriars, my thanks to Dominic White, the prior, John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of Las Casas Institute, and thanks to Nick Austin, who's the Master of Campion Hall. Special thanks to John McCabe and colleagues at Georgetown who have made this Zoom event happen. To Maggie, my wife, who does the administration from this end. I'd like to thank all of those of you who asked questions. I'm sorry I didn't get through all of them, but I tried to make sure that the majority of them were asked. I thank the others of you for attending today and for your support of our various series. I'm Professor Michael Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott or LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. You can't find me on X. I wonder why. Until next time, take care, keep safe. Goodbye.